Okay, I think we'll start to get the proceedings going. It's absolutely my pleasure and delight to welcome Mark Weiner to our community here at the School of Professional Studies. He is a very well-respected author, commentator, executive in the space of PR and communications, especially in this field we want to discuss today about how to integrate data and technology and insights more generally into the work that PR professionals do. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Diamond. I'm the Academic Director of the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department here at the School of Professional Studies in its Division of Programs and Business. And it is absolutely my delight to be in this conversation. I was thrilled when we started talking to Mark about this a while back, and then with the book being published, it gave us a really good excuse to have him join us. For those of you who have entered the competition, and there is a competition involved, to get a couple of free copies of the book, if you hang out to the end, you'll be able to. We'll tell you who won, and more importantly, we'll also provide you a code. Or how you can order the book on Amazon at a good discount. So, anyway, Mark, I think that one of the questions, when we involve leading professionals in our work here at the school, which is very often as a School of Professional Studies, is a question about how you got started and how did you even get into this field of PR or measurement or data. So, could you tell us a little bit about your origin story?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to join you and students. And in your honor, I'm wearing a violet shirt, paying my respects. So the way I got started was, there's a story there, and I think it's best explained by a quote from Kierkegaard, the philosopher, who says, "The difficulty in life is that it has to be lived moving forward, but can only be understood looking backward." I paraphrase. So I was an English major. I was challenged throughout university to drop that major because there was no career in it. I transferred out of school as a business major. That lasted until I could get, I think, 60% of my tuition back. And then I switched back into English, and that's where I graduated. And in many ways, I work in my major. I'm not a data person. I really I think for this will tell you in Excel I know how to do auto sum. That's it. So it's more like bridging the concepts of research and analysis and communication. So I started my career at the New York Times news service. I was very lucky. I continued in the news business for my first two positions, and then switched to public relations. But the public relations course that I took in my career was working at service providers. So I did work at agencies, but most of my career was spent in leading research organizations devoted to communication, and that's what I do still.
Yeah, I think this left brain, right brain, sort of balance of the artistic or the literary and someone who's oriented towards data and analytics is something that we've been emphasizing a lot at the school. I mean, we have sort of captured the thinking in the phrase human-centered and data-driven. Hopefully, our teaching students to sort of address both sides of their brains in that. But it seems to me like that might be a hint at a kind of broader issue or a broader question about why actually you felt it was kind of timely and necessary to write this book. Yeah. So what is it about the PR industry that makes that makes you want to sit down and pull together these really quite rich insights about data and technology for the industry?
Well, thank you. This is my second book on the topic. The first one was in 2006. So it takes 15 years to pull together the stories that make a book. And I was I write frequently. I have a monthly column for PRSA's Strategy and Tactics, PR News, and also Reagan. So I'm busy writing, and the book was a collection of the writings. So in a way, I was chipping away at it throughout the entire process. And I'm lucky enough to have had these experiences, these principally client experiences. There may be 2 or 3 a year that really stand out, that are recognized for awards and enable me to tell the story, the measurement story, to people who are not measurement oriented. And so that came together in 2021. The book was published early in the year, and it's doing very well. And it's one reason I'm grateful for this opportunity today, is to tell more people about the book, and we'll be giving 2 copies away later.
So, I think the impression, and we have this conversation with students coming into the program, the impression about PR is, it's almost, a lot of people think they're coming to a program that will lead them to a character in Sex and the City or something like that. That's all going to be glamorous and, events and famous people. So, there's certainly, certain reputational problems perhaps PR itself has as a function, and perhaps one that's a bit more business oriented. I'd love to sort of chat to you about is this question about, can you really measure the impact of public relations and comms efforts, and how, historically, I think you'd argue that the industry has had some concerns and anxieties about that. And so I wonder, whether you think that's changed significantly in the last 5, 10, 15 years, but either the problem or the solution. What's your perspective? What have you seen over the years you've been working on this?
Well, popular culture is not particularly kind to our chosen profession. So Sex and the City, Sweet Smell of Success, think about the movies, and it doesn't, I don't think, properly represent what we do. But there's, if you look at the foundations of public relations in the way I'm sure you do in class, Edward Bernays was a social scientist, and it's evident in his writing. So this approach was present at the earliest stages of public relations. It's not as popularly practiced as one might think while in university. There are principles and there's a science of public relations that I think is in textbooks. In practice, it's not that common, but those people who do practice the science of public relations as well as the art, I think, have enormous advantages in their careers and in their and probably I think also in their happiness in the career, because so many challenges in public relations relate to creative aspects, and research is actually the foundation of creation. So rather than brainstorms, which were very common but sometimes rote, research provides new ways of tackling common communications challenges in new and creative ways, and it provides the foundation to focus one's creativity in those ways in which it can do the most good.
Yeah, I think it's clear that, analysis or research and certainly insights can drive creativity, and that, this notion that the two are in opposition to each other is probably a bit of it's never been a fair characterization of either. But I'm curious more around the measurement of impact. So let's say we can all agree that the industry benefits from and has been driven by greater insights, qualitative or quantitative insights. But what about the measurement of the impact? I imagine chief executive officers and CFOs have asked you, when you serve them, or ask your colleagues in the industry all the time about how can you tell me this is really working? What's working, and why should I continue spending money in this area? What have you seen develop in the last 5-10 years in that space?
Well, I think most organizational leaders, the board and the C-suite, recognize that reputation is important. And I think events in the last year bear that out. And remind me to come back to that. But the organizations run on data, and public relations and corporate communication is one of the last holdouts in the organization to abide by that. So data is the foundation for most business decisions. And when we talk about buzz and breaking through the media clutter and these ways of describing our success in ways that are not quantitative, it actually prohibits our integration and the resources that come with integration. Because in my experience, doing advanced statistical modeling called market mix modeling, public relations generates enormous returns when compared to mass market advertising, price promotions, and others. And when we choose not to measure, we're actually prohibiting ourselves from advancing with bigger budgets, with a more prominent role within the organization. And it's an active choice. It's an active choice that I've never understood. And surprisingly, it's still prevalent even in Fortune 500 companies, and certainly among the agencies that serve those companies. So as I'd say that maybe half of those organizations that initiate this process of applying research and evaluation to communication, I'd say only half of them really are initiated from within the comms team. It's sometimes, half the time it's being imposed on them that there's a need to measure because there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what public relations is and what corporate communication can do. And without data, we inhibit our own growth because we're not able to demonstrate the value and return on investment in the same ways that others do, that almost everybody else does within the organization. And the irony is that we have such a great story to tell.
So do you think the agencies, I mean, you mentioned that you didn't think necessarily the agencies had sort of filled the gap either, but if I look at the amount of corporate activity, mergers and acquisitions and big announcements from the agency world generally, it seems like a lot of that energy historically has been focused on data, or in the last few years. I'm familiar with some of the efforts that Edelman have made to build up their data, skill sets, and other companies in the space, obviously. But have the, not asking you to comment on any one agency in particular, but where do you think the agencies are trying to take this profession in terms of supporting their clients with data, and how are they thinking about integrating data into their work?
Well, when you mention Edelman or Ketchum, Weber Shandwick, Golan Harris, these are agencies that devote, and there's others, they devote significant amount of resources to research and evaluation, to pre-test programs, to evaluate programs at a much higher level of professionalism. But once you drop out of maybe the top 8 or 10 agencies by size, their ability to deliver that kind of research and insight diminishes dramatically. And I don't know the statistic, but I believe that the majority of the population practicing public relations is more likely to be found in smaller organizations than those giant organizations. So those organizations, many of them, are a part of larger holding companies, and those larger holding companies recognize that data is the way to integrate public relations, their public relations agency, with their advertising or social agencies that specialize. So having data enables us to collaborate more effectively and more efficiently in a way that delivers returns for the client. So the reluctance to embrace data, I think that is breaking down a bit, because technology has made data access so much more ubiquitous. So now there are free tools, low-cost tools, and I think we're at the point where everybody has a tool, pretty much. And now the question is not so much can you measure, it's how to manage the tool and how to think about the data that's generated through the tool. And that's not a common talent in public relations. It's not the orientation in practice. It may be at university, but it doesn't often continue. I'm encouraged, however, that there are now programs that offer communications data science as a degree, and that's the future. So I think the future is certainly headed in that direction, because now there's an area of concentration that focuses on communications research and evaluation, and over time those people are going to be CCOs. Now we're seeing the last of a generation of CCOs who might have been journalists first, trained in journalism, not necessarily coming through programs like yours at NYU. But now there's a higher level of professionalism coming out of university and graduate school, and those graduates are equipped to lead this type of evolution in a way that their predecessors may not have been.
Yeah, and I think that probably speaks as well to a kind of broader increasing data literacy, that we see in society, or if not in society, at least in the educational. I don't think there are too many students, undergrads today, in whatever discipline, if they go to a school that requires, some kind of program of study across multiple subjects, aren't required to do some kind of data or analysis or statistics or programming. It seems to become a new kind of lingua franca, that an educated person needs to understand data. So hopefully, that, as you said, filters in. It's certainly part of our program, and should indeed become a bigger part, a focus on the, as you said, the measurement and evaluation of impact, etc. I'm wondering a little bit if you could share with us, some specific examples of sort of things that you think where new capabilities have been created or new initiatives enabled, leveraging, data and perhaps even algorithms or AI. You have a number of good case studies in the book, and I'm sure some of them provide good storytelling, just to give a better flavor of the impact that this is starting to have.
Well, I think that is the way that communicators connect with research, is through the stories. That so telling, describing some statistical function, I think leaves it does not communicate effectively the power of data and research and analysis, but the stories do. And being able to talk about the success that one organization or another had through the benefit of research, that's really where the power is. And I think that's one reason why I've managed in this space without any real statistical background. When I went, I don't know how it is now, but when I went to school at university, there were no requirements. So I didn't have to take any math classes. And I was happy about that. I think the last math class I took was called Math for Non-Math Majors in my senior year in high school. So I managed to get away with it. But I'm able to communicate the power of the data through these stories. And the book is full of those stories. And maybe that's why it took 15 years to write the book. I had to accumulate all those stories, because even though we're here today, data-informed communication is not as common as one might think.
And any stories in particular that you want to share? I'll share one I thought was a very interesting insight, and I forget to whom to attribute it, but it was a discussion about actually the corporate communications, or to some extent really the IR, the investor relations function, where this particular CCO had dedicated herself, and a company was dedicated to building out a position in terms of social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. And those things, as you know, are now getting evaluated by various different ratings agencies. And, you know, they go in the overall evaluation of a stock, and that influences investors, or there are certain classes of investors that only want to invest in CSR, you know, highly rated CSR stocks, et cetera. So what she had figured out was that the way the communications and the press releases, et cetera, were being presented, and everything's searchable today, you know, Googleable, and you know, can be ingested into various different machines. She realized that that wasn't really positioning the company as well as it needed to be. And so they invested some time and effort in developing a more algorithmic approach to, you know, what went in the press releases, the words used, etc. It's almost like search engine optimization. And she made this wonderful and memorable statement when she said that the age of PR has moved from the PR has moved from the age of the golden Rolodex to the golden algorithm. And I thought that was a very interesting observation, you know, of one of the biggest shifts in the industry, and how someone thoughtfully was beginning to use this to actually impact the work they're doing. You know, so I don't know if you had some other stories along those lines of people you've talked to, you know, who've really seen, a different way of doing business.
Well, yeah, so help me stay on track, because I have two thoughts in response to this. One is that the idea that ESG is now the foundation of investment decision-making is might have been implicit among communicators, that reputation matters and stock price is affected by reputation. I think that's generally true, and it's been proven in a variety of ways. But with ESG becoming an investment criteria, like the sole, in some cases, you know, a fund will not invest in a particular company if it does not have a high ESG score. So much of ESG is behavior, but it's also the ability of the communication team to increase awareness of that company's behavior, you know, in promoting ESG in their activities. So that is so that's I think two directions coming towards one another. The case you're describing, and most cases, are more really focused on three areas of return on investment. And of course, if a company operates more efficiently, it will attract every kind of investor. But the reputation aspect of it, which can be managed, is what's driving ESG investment. The three elements, and there are stories for these in the book, for return on investment are either communications ability to drive revenue, which is the sexy one. Everybody wants to talk about that. The second one is our ability to drive efficiency. In other words, generating more for less with less. That is the most accessible form of return on investment, but it's limited because it can only save some fraction of the existing budget, right? So that's usually small to begin with. The third element is the most impactful, and that is avoiding catastrophic cost. So reputation cost, it can be enormous, in the billions of dollars, far exceeding whatever communications, whatever sales can be attributed to communication. Maybe the sexy one, but it's not the most impactful. And of course, one great measure of success is a crisis avoided, because we see what's happened to some of the world's great brands as a result of poor decision-making in operation, and then poor decision-making in subsequent communication. So those three elements come together. One, if you like, I can give you some examples of each. Ford Motor Company introduced the Mustang Mach-E, which was a pretty radical departure from the traditional Mustang, in that it was electric, it was 4 doors, it was more like an SUV than a sports car. So in introducing this car under the Mustang brand, Ford had to be very careful not to alienate its fans, but attract a new kind of audience, you know, family, you know, environmentally conscious families to whom that car is targeted. Anyway, they led with public relations. They led with media after doing a serious amount of research in advance, as well as throughout the process to tweak and refine throughout the introduction. The car was sold out before it was produced. It was sold out online. So this was an example of public relations working in concert with other aspects of the organization to lead, and it was a great success. In the case of doing more with less, the efficiency measure, the example in the book is for Adobe, whose senior management complained about a competitor, that the competitor was getting all the attention and they weren't getting all the attention. But when we worked on this, looked at the data behind it, we found that it's true this competitor was generating more coverage, but when we looked at which journalists had written about Adobe more than once, the 2,000 journalist database that they supported, every day, turned out only 500 of them had written about Adobe more than once. So they realized those 1,500 were a form of waste. It wasn't money well spent anyway. So then we dug deeper on those 500 and found that of those 500 who had written more than once, 150 of them were cited frequently in social media by the target audience: CEOs, CMOs, CTOs, and CCOs. The people who are buying Adobe, and they often hyperlink to an article. So it was easy to trace those articles to find out which media they were actually reading and redistributing. And so that list of 500 came down to 150, and they were able to achieve great savings, great efficiency, because the communications team no longer had to support 2,000 journalists. They focused on the 150, and they did not, and their overall results were not diminished in terms of how the extent to which they were delivering intended messages to the intended audience versus this competitor. So the decision was made. It was clear to the C-suite that the competitor was over-investing in a lot of activity that did not drive sales, whereas Adobe did the work and understood how to target. And then in cases of avoiding catastrophic cost, the ones you hear about are the ones that did not avoid catastrophic cost. There are a lot of companies that have not done a great job, either through their behavior or how they communicate in response to their behavior when they're called on it. But there are examples also in the book of an organization, a power utility that was able to avert a crisis when they missed earnings after the CEO had announced that they would never reduce the dividend, and they missed earnings. They were going to have to do something about the dividend. The CEO asked whether this ought to be communicated in advance of earnings. He called together the legal team and the communications team. The legal team suggested that they say nothing. The PR team said, get out in front of it. We did research to look at 10 organizations, all of whom in the power utility space, all of whom had missed earnings. And of those 10, 5 chose the communications advice, and 5 took the advice of lawyers to say nothing. All the companies' stock price went down in the first 2 weeks, but those that rebounded were those that took the PR path. The ones that said nothing continued to slide. Stock price went down over the course of the next 12 months. One went out of business, and it was easy, even though it was not like cause and effect research. The coincidence of these patterns was enough. In the 48 hours we were given to do this analysis, the CEO made the decision to get out in front of the issue, take the PR advice. Stock price did go down for a couple of weeks, but then returned, and actually beat the average of those companies that we had examined. So that was a case that supported PR decision making that resulted in a stock price increase.
I think it's actually a good segue to a question I had wanted to ask you. In the book, you talk about inputs and outputs and outcomes and business results, and these are things definitely that we teach in the program. But I think it would be helpful to get your kind of gloss on that. That there are very distinct ways we need to be thinking about how PR interacts with the world. So could you talk about a bit about that, and then I want to come back to the questions of ethics and social responsibility, which I think are also some fascinating things to talk about. So
okay, well, I think if you're studying inputs, outputs, outcomes, business results in class, then you've covered the topic. The difficulty, I think, is what happens in practice. And in the practice, these are not such common distinctions. So inputs, by that we mean the resources that are invested, whether it's hours, money, whatever those resources are. And that sets the stage for a return on investment conversation. If you know how much you invested, you know what to measure your performance against. And one of the great advantages of public relations, it's like a dual reality. It's a challenge and it's a benefit in cases too, is that the average level of spending in public relations within the marketing communication mix is less than 0.5% on average. So I told you already, I'm not a math guy, I'm not a stats guy, but I know this much, that less than 0.5% rounds down to zero. Take that and factor it by the slow rate of decay of public relations communication. So when our PR efforts result in news, that news is searchable forever. And that means the life of that story is a long life. So when you take low cost and long life, you have a very positive return that you can attribute to public relations and news in particular, media relations in particular, where an advertisement, a mass market ad, is shown to continue to perform for about 2 weeks after the ad ends. Price promotions end the day that the price goes back to normal, and for public relations, it can last. We had cases where it lasts for months. So that's an extraordinary return. And when we've been able to make those cases, resources flow into public relations. So one of the challenges is having these such low budgets. And the irony is that public relations delivers the best return, but it gets the smallest budget. It also it has a long life, and when compared to advertising and price promotions, those are usually advertising, mass market advertising for a consumer products company consumes about 85% of the budget, overall budget. They deliver on average about 10 cents on the dollar in terms of sales. Price promotions lose 25 cents on the dollar because you're giving away product in exchange for a trial. And public relations in the form of media relations delivers anywhere from $8 to $35 that I've seen. So that's an enormous return on investment. And if PR's budget goes up by 400%, which seems enormous, it means that you're now up to 2%, which the advertising people would consider a rounding error that they freely accept as waste because the ad didn't run on time, it got clipped on TV, whatever. So public relations delivers the best return, and that's how we do it.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating way to frame this, actually, Mark. This idea of applying lifetime value almost to the messages, and which has this deeper, longer resonance. I'm not really thought about it in that context, but I think that's a really interesting way of positioning it. And probably, I imagine that it hinges on what's still difficult for people to get their head around, which is that the impacts happen over a longer term, you know. So for those who are looking for the quick hit, the quick fix, which includes, you know, most public companies driven by quarterly earnings, you know, it's a harder case to make that, you know, what you've been doing is about building, you know, longer term value. Of course, it's the right case to make, but it's still a harder case to make.
Well, and it's one reason I think why these stories are so important, because the stories may contradict the status quo thinking within the organization. Conventional wisdom may be that you know, you have to yield a fast return. I might suggest in a situation like that, that poor reputation will absolutely yield instantaneous results, and they will be the sort of results that nobody would ever want. Those are the ones that come fast. Now, there are cases where public relations activity in the form of like event sponsorships or other types of promotions that that yield sales quickly, but and PR can do that. But the real return, the secret of that that huge multiple is the life of that communication, that it lives on. You know, if it lives on, you know, in on search, but also in social media. So when I was looking for a car at one time, I did a search on Google. I wanted to find this particular type of car, and the number one thing that popped up on Google was a local dealership, and it was somebody's comment about how horrible it was and how they gouged them. And I would never go to that dealership. And that dealership, I saw that there for years. I would go back and just check and see if it had changed, if they had done anything, and they hadn't. So that's the first thing I saw, and I chose, you know, to never go there. And I'm sure lots of other people made the same decision.
Yeah, I think we've had some interesting discussions now, or you've touched on a couple of times this point about reputation and the importance of reputation and managing that and avoiding disasters, and we recognize that that's a big part of the PR practice and crisis communications, etc. I wanted to sort of pivot a little bit, you know, perhaps to a related topic around the ethics of the industry itself, you know, and I think that historically there's been some anxieties among practitioners themselves that that there's been a death of PR, or that, you know, PR has somehow lost its way and missed its ethical roots, you know, the famous Page principles and others. But I think there's also more recently clearly been some deep concerns about the way tools like social media are being used and the ethical implications of that. So I wonder whether, you know, you may wish to comment more generally about this relationship of PR and ethics. We had a wonderful conversation with Ken Kerrigan several months ago about this. He wrote a book about it. But I also would be interested to know whether you think the world of data and technology is changing that frame of reference at all about ethics and the character of PR.
That's an interesting approach to the question. My first response is that I think because of universities like NYU bringing up and introducing the future leaders of public relations, ethics are a part of what people learn now. And so students are coming out and they're better equipped to face ethical challenges in the workplace in a way that you know, maybe predecessors hadn't. At least there was no formal training. It was more like a moral intuition about what's right and what's wrong. And now I think we're also living at a time where ethics are much more highly codified than ever. So knowing and I see this in practice all the time with DEI and CSR and ESG, all the acronyms, that organizations are much more conscientious, and they invest in these ethical frameworks in a way that just I don't think existed in the past. So I think data helps to across the whole pantheon, not just in communication, but I think data helps to hold people accountable. You know, the challenge is the willingness to accept the data, right? So it's not about whether the data exists or not, or whether the data can provide insight. It can. It's more like the challenge is the willingness of people and executives to accept these new business principles, these new world principles, and to adopt them and adapt to them. And data helps to manage, just in the same way, in a car, you have an instrument panel. It tells you how fast you're going, how much fuel you have. Those are key indicators to get to your destination. And that data is providing the same source of information for an organization and its leaders.
Yeah, I think I agree with you to some extent, in the sense that you still find lots of leaders who are uncomfortable trusting data and the insights of data, especially less trusting of things like predictive modeling and things, black box AI, things that are not tangible and accessible to their own experience. Lots of senior managers still sort of trade off their own intuition or experience or history or success or whatever. But I guess I'm less convinced more and more these days that data is this sort of all-knowing, all-seeing source of truth. And I think there's been a lot of good work, about things like data feminism and algorithms of oppression, and what is the great book about the great math weapons of mass destruction? These great titles of books, all of which have I think proven pretty conclusively that the nature of data is governed a lot by who's doing the collection and who are you getting data about, etc. So that the data is not pure.
Yeah, I agree with you. So we don't disagree. I think conversations are livelier when people do disagree, but I don't disagree with you in this case. But my response is more like I'd rather be approximately right than totally in the dark. So if somebody made that decision, let's say the data indicates one thing, and then there's a decision by a CEO to do something differently to protect a particular interest of that organization or of that CEO. I know those things happen. I suppose some organizations profit from that sort of behavior, but I also see what happens to those who are caught doing it, and they suffer. So I think that we're seeing some of this in the headlines this week about data being available and organizational leadership choosing to ignore it or bury it. And that company is suffering. It's in the headlines, for this whole last week. I don't know if I need to name them, but so yes, there are unethical players. There's immoral people. Some of them lead large organizations, but and some of them work in public relations. So one of the challenges we have in our profession, I think, is that the public relations profession needs public relations to boost its own reputation. We talked about those movies at the beginning of the show, or Sex and the City. The popular culture has not been a friend of public relations, and I think we have to hold ourselves accountable and aspire to be recognized as a real profession. Every time I write on LinkedIn about the profession, there's this one person who always nips at me saying, what makes this a profession? And I don't have, so I use practitioners instead of professionals sometimes to appease that guy. But, we aspire to be a profession. And in order to be a profession, we have to have standards, and just like any other profession, ethics are a part of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more actually on that aspect, and I'm actually quite interested in just sort of pursuing that thought. There's lots of fields, including data visualization, which is one of my sort of side hustles, where there isn't really an ethics, there isn't a sort of clear ethics about those industries. So I want to invite everybody. We have sort of 10, 12 minutes left. If anybody is interested in, popping in a question, try and use the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You should see a Q&A, couple of bubbles, and I will try and pick them up. I do have some other questions, including some questions that tend to be very popular. Most students, I think, are with us because they hope that their education will give them some quite specific skills or capabilities, and they are looking to folks like you for guidance about what they should be doing and what they should be considering, how they should sort of train themselves and engage themselves. So what do you think are some of the more specific skills and areas of knowledge that you might that we ought to be considering or seeking out, students ought to be seeking out? So.
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed with the professionalism of students coming out of university now. I see universities producing people who are ready to succeed in a way that wasn't so clear to me in the past. And I think it relates to this specialization that I referred to earlier. Now, I generally speaking, I believe that the science of public relations is on the rise, and anyone who and I think to ignore it is to do that at your own peril. So I remember 15 years ago hiring somebody who had graduated from a graduate program that was heavily, there's like one student in every graduating class, two students maybe, who have a keen interest in data, the data part of communication. But and when he looked for a job, he wanted to hear more about how the agencies or how these prospective employers use data in the way that he was taught and the way that he wanted to pursue his career. And they had no answer for him. So they would put him through writing tests. They would have him do practice pitch calls. That's entry level in most organizations, despite what we're talking about is something that I think it doesn't usually happen. It hasn't usually happened right away, but I think what's happening now is that those people, those 1%ers who have a balanced interest in the creative aspects of communication as well as the scientific aspects, have an enormous advantage. Because the legacy leaders of these corporate departments and the agencies don't have those skills, so they hire those skills, and it's becoming more and more a part of the practice. So I recommend that, unlike me, that you balance your education, at least take a class in communications data science to at least be exposed to it, because it's one way to get in and differentiate yourself from every other candidate who might have a degree in public relations but may not understand the science. The other things, I think, the things that I look for when I have two more things. One is what I look for in a candidate is perseverance and enthusiasm, which is not something that appears on a resume per se. So it's how you communicate, how you represent yourself in an interview to differentiate yourself from all these others. I think that taking advantage of LinkedIn and and Twitter, creating a reputation in advance of graduation, get involved in whatever you can get involved in, PR, SSA, whatever organizations are available to get internships, get practical experience, because it gives you a great advantage. My son is 27, and I saw how he worked it. He was a business major, works in mergers and acquisitions, but I saw how he did what he did, and he did not rely on what I'll call the conventional wisdom, like the sort of thing that I did. Graduate, no internships. It was a long time ago, but. And then finally, I would expand my scope of search to include organizations that provide services to PR people. That's how I came through. I started my career as a journalist, not as a PR person. And then when I switched to public relations, it was working for PR service companies, not PR agencies or PR corporate communications departments. So you can widen your search and improve your odds by including service providers. These are the companies that help with research like mine does, or help with release distribution or video production and distribution. Those companies need skilled communicators because that's who the client is. And the more that training you have, the more readily you'll relate to clients and they'll relate to you. But and I'll also say finally, there's not enough talent in public relations right now. There's so much competition to fill empty positions. I've never seen anything like it. And I know that how challenging it is for organizations that are looking to hire the best people. There's a real shortage of those people.
Well, that's good news, I hope, for our students at least. It creates opportunities that hadn't been there before. I got a couple of housekeeping things I need to do. The two winners of the ebook who will receive an email after the webinar with instructions on how to claim this ebook are Anna Mims and Christopher Basie. So congratulations to the two of you. And appreciate you sticking around with us. I guess we have just a minute or two, and then we'll wrap. But I'm kind of fascinated. I'm always fascinated by what you are reading and seeing and interacting. Like I always want to ask others what they think is cool. I must have a sort of total FOMO about me on that. So anything you've seen recently, and you don't have to name names if you don't want, but is there technology that we should be looking at? Do you see some sort of cool partnerships you think are worth thinking through? So
I don't think this is the question you're asking me to answer, but I'm going to give you the answer I want to give you, if you'll forgive me. The best reading I would recommend is to go to the Institute for Public Relations, www.institute4pr.org, where there's a lot of free content. If you're interested in the science of public relations, it's a great resource, and I recommend it. The other thing I want to say in the moment we have left is that the discount code for the book, it's 20 off. It's only at the publisher's website. It's not at Amazon. So you have to go to www.coganpage, KOGANPAGE.com. They'll ask for a discount code, and I think it's Cogan page 20. I should know the code. I just know that I know that you have it. So if you'll share it in the chat, everybody else can have it.
Yep.
I just want to make sure that they don't try to use it on Amazon because it won't work there.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And in your magnanimity, you've just now shared it with anyone else that watches this video after we post it. But we hope that the increase in volume makes up for the decrease in revenue. So we'll be engaged. Look, I think it is probably a good time to close. I wanted to do this conversation for a while, and I'm really pleased we did. And I'm very pleased that you kept it balanced. These conversations we've had in the past sometimes get too techy in a way, and we're suddenly into areas of what one vice provost once called fancy math, and I like the fancy math, but I also really appreciate your continuing to remind us about the balance and balance in people's careers. So, with that, I really want to thank you. I look forward to seeing you and welcoming you back. And we will, send this recording out to folks who participated and those who had registered and everybody who showed an interest. And I'll make sure, since I know this got a lot of interest on your own LinkedIn and my LinkedIn and others, that we'll share this out with that group, anyone who missed it. But very much big thank you from us at NYU School of Professional Studies, and encourage anyone listening or joining to continue the dialogue with us or directly with Mark via LinkedIn, I guess.
Yeah, that would be great. And just look at the color of the book. You see the publisher. It was serendipity, but it's the right violet. And I'm wearing my violet shirt out of respect for the university.
Well, right, and we're recording this on the Alumni and Parents Weekend as well. So go Violets, as they say. Go Violets.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks very much, Mike.
Bye.